Why is JoJo's manga released so slowly? This is a common question that comes up whenever the English manga release of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is brought up. In this video, I wanted to discuss the history and current state of JoJo's English manga release, and the two main reasons behind why I think there is such a slow release, with these two main reasons being 1. Financial constraints, and 2. Supply chain issues. When looking into the history and current state of JoJo's English manga release, we mainly need to focus on Viz Media, the publishing company that releases JoJo's in English. Viz Media originally published Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, separately from the other parts of the series. They most likely focused on releasing Part 3 first, because it was the most well-known part of the series, due to the 1990s OVA anime adaptations by studio A.P.P.P, which had been released in the English market by Super Techno Arts in the early 2000s. Volume 1 of Part 3 was released by Viz in November 2005, with volumes being released on a bi-monthly schedule, later switching to a quarterly schedule, and slowing down even further to a tri-annual schedule, possibly due to low sales numbers at the time. During the middle of Stardust Crusaders' English release, there was a one-year hiatus between the release of volumes 10 and 11, due to a controversy involving a scene in the 6th episode of the OVAs, The Mist of Vengeance. In this episode, there was a scene depicting the main villain, Dio Brando, vowing to kill the main character, Jotaro Kujo, while looking at pages of the Quran, the main religious text of Islam. The original scene in the manga was not depicted in this way. However, Egyptian Islamic fundamentalists did share their disapproval towards the animation. In response to this controversy, Shueisha, the Japanese publisher of JoJo's, and studio A.P.P.P, issued a formal apology. Following this, shipments of the anime and manga were halted in Japan and the US. The manga did eventually start being sold again. However, it was only after Hirohiko Araki, the mangaka of JoJo's, had redrawn certain scenes that Shueisha deemed inappropriate. For example, scenes where buildings that look like mosques were illustrated in fight scenes. After this controversy, Viz did eventually start releasing the manga again, with volume 11 releasing in April 2009, going back to a tri-annual release schedule afterwards, with the final volume of Part 3 being released in December 2010. While Viz Media did fully release Part 3, many fans speculated if the earlier and later parts of the series would ever get released in English. Eventually, their wishes were granted, with Viz announcing the release of the JoJonium editions, an omnibus re-release of the first 3 parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Phantom Blood, Battle Tendency, and Stardust Crusaders. These editions were hardcover, featured updated cover art by Hirohiko Araki, as well as some color pages, among many other quirks and features. Viz started their release of the JoJonium editions digitally in September 2014, and physically in February 2015. They then began releasing volumes on a quarterly release schedule. However, as Viz was following the Japanese release of the JoJonium editions, which only went up to Part 3 of the series, fans again speculated if Viz would release the later parts of the series, or once again stop at Part 3. Once again, Viz came in clutch when they announced the release of the deluxe hardcover editions for Part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable, a new hardcover edition that would be aesthetically similar to the JoJonium editions. So far, Part 5, Golden Wind, has also gotten the deluxe hardcover edition treatment, with plans for Part 6, Stone Ocean, to get the same later this year. While we have been consistently getting a new JoJo's volume every 3 months since February 2015, along with the occasional side story, Reddit user PaulsTomb pointed out that if Viz Media keeps at their current pace, we won't see the ending of Part 8 JoJolion until at least 2032, which is almost a decade from now, as of the recording of this video. All of this is also not accounting for the fact that Part 9, the JoJo Lands, started earlier this year, making the path of catching up to Japan even further away. So that brings up the question, with how successful JoJo's is as a franchise, why is the manga released so slowly? When it comes to accelerating the release of JoJo's manga, there are some financial constraints for both the publisher and the customers. Let me explain. When taking a look at JoJo's most recent sales data from 2021, the series sold roughly 455,806 copies in the US, making it the 12th highest selling manga series that year. Generally speaking, when a manga series isn't selling too well, publishers will slow down the release cycle of the series, basically releasing it less often than they did before. With that being said, you would think that if a series sells well, it would prompt publishers to release it faster, but sadly that isn't always the case, for many different reasons, with the main reason being how there are many fixed costs for publishing companies that are associated with releasing a manga physically, with some of these costs being printing, shipping, distribution, warehousing, and marketing of the final product. Paper printing and shipping costs specifically seem to have gone up the most in the past few years. With that being said, Viz has actually accelerated the release pace of a few manga series in the past in order to catch up to the Japanese release much faster. when they were significantly behind, with the most notable example of this being Naruto. Back in the day when Viz was publishing Naruto, they were pretty far behind the Japanese release. So in order to catch up quicker, they started to release 3 volumes a month for 4 months straight. They also did something similar during Shippuden's release as well. While this situation may seem like an outlier, because Naruto was one of the most successful manga ever for Viz Media, there are examples of Viz Media doing this for other manga series as well. So it could potentially be a possibility for JoJo's if it continues to sell well, since the precedent has already been set. While I've touched on the financial constraints that Viz Media may face while releasing JoJo's, there are also some financial constraints that could affect fans of the series as well. Let's just say that in theory, if Viz Media were to accelerate the pace of JoJo's release to a new volume every month or two, many readers may not be able to afford to buy a new volume at that new pace, since the volumes retail for $19.99 USD. To be fair, volumes are sold for lower prices at certain retailers, and there is the occasional sale, but many fans do still purchase from retailers that charge MSRP, or close to it. Also, while many hardcore fans would still purchase every volume that comes out, at the end of the day, manga isn't a necessity, so many people may choose to spend whatever discretionary spending they do have on other things during these uncertain times. All of these factors combined make it a very nuanced situation for Viz. With all of that being said, there is still a lot of incentive for Viz to increase the pace of JoJo's release. To me, it seems like the pros outweigh the cons. So knowing all of this, it may be upsetting from a fan's perspective, but we do have to understand that there are certain things that are out of Viz's control, meaning that even if Viz did want to accelerate the pace of JoJo's manga release, they may have issues being able to meet the new demand. Last year I made a video covering the manga shortage, and while the situation has improved in the past year, some of the issues I brought up in that video are still ongoing. Kevin Hamric, the vice president of publishing sales at Viz Media, highlights the reasons behind why Viz is still having some trouble with supplying manga. In an interview with ICV2, there was a little bit of reprieve in May and June of 2022, but now we're back into a problematic time because of paper shortages and employee shortages. They can't get enough employees to work the presses. They can't get enough employees to drive the trucks. There's not enough employees at ports, and there's not enough employees at our warehouses. Hamric stated that he does think that these supply chain issues will eventually get better, but possibly not until well into 2023, sometime during this summer. He believes that the situation will improve because Viz has spoken with their binderies and printers, who sees how much Viz has been printing. Due to the increase in popularity for manga in the past few years, that has caused demand for manga to skyrocket, which Viz has not been able to keep up with. So to alleviate these issues, they're giving Viz a larger allocation at the printers. Due to these new developments, Hamric stated that whenever a new volume comes out, Viz does have enough copies available to meet the demand. We've got enough, and then a little extra after that. We've also been able to stagger the reprints for new releases. We may have a first printing, but we may have already called the second and third printing, just so we know that we've got the supply coming in to meet the demand after the first initial sales period. To me, it seems like the greater issue is when the demand for an older series is suddenly higher than Viz expects, which can happen for many different reasons. For example, an older manga series getting a new anime adaptation, or an older series being recommended by people online. Earlier last year, in a different interview with ICV2, Hamric commented on how people will read a manga series wherever it's available. The readers are very resilient. If they can't find it one place, they're going to go another place. For example, they were reading the ebook version before they could find the physical book somewhere. This specific comment by Hamric is significant because around the time that this interview was conducted, Viz Media Shonen Jump app had just added JoJo's Part 6, Stone Ocean. They initially released the first 8 chapters, with the new chapter being released every week since then. This was a smart business move by Viz Media, because they were likely trying to capitalize on the hype of the anime adaptation, which had started airing around that time. Also, releasing a manga digitally does cut out many of the fixed costs of releasing physical manga that I mentioned earlier, although publishers do still have to pay for any expenses related to licensing, translation, and localization of the manga, which can be significant for a longer series like JoJo's. Translating JoJo specifically also comes with some legal risks. Viz themselves commented on the difficulties with translating JoJo's in a 2013 Facebook post. The difficulty with JoJo is that it's basically a lawyer's nightmare, with all the blatant references to real musicians and fashion designers. As such, it's really difficult to release it at all, let alone uncensored. It's an excellent series, but it's one that requires even more work than the typical manga. In order to avoid these legal issues, Viz uses copyright-free names as official English substitutes. At the end of the day, what all of this does tell us is that until Viz has more of a handle on their supply chain issues, hopefully by sometime later this year, they may not have the ability to increase production until then. So in the meantime, they're giving us what they can, such as the digital release of Stone Ocean. So at this point you might be asking yourself, is JoJo's doomed to be released this slowly for years until we finally catch up to the Japanese release? Well, that's not completely the case. There are two scenarios that I think could play out. The realistic scenario and the best case scenario for fans. In the realistic scenario, it's highly likely that Viz will keep releasing JoJo's at their current pace. I know that's not what fans want to hear, but the series has proven to be a great seller for them over the years. So in their eyes, why fix something that isn't broken? They also benefit from each part of the manga getting an anime adaptation every few years by David Productions. The anime adaptations act as advertisements for the source material, so people are always aware of the new parts that are coming up in the release schedule. Viz has capitalized on this phenomenon historically as well. For example, when the anime adaptation of Stardust Crusaders was airing, Viz reprinted the single volume release of the manga. This was also around the time that the JoJonium editions were announced. In the best case scenario for fans, if two factors combine, we could see an accelerated release of JoJo's English manga, with the first factor being, if Viz is able to work out their supply chain issues sometime during this year, that'll give them the ability to streamline the production process. The second factor is the fact that a lot of Stone Ocean will already have a lot of its translation and lettering completed, so these aspects of the release process won't be as much of an issue as they have been for earlier parts of the series. In my opinion, if these two factors happen simultaneously, Viz will have the ability to release JoJo's physically much faster than they've ever done before. We'll just have to wait and see how it all plays out later this year, as we get closer to Stone Ocean's physical release. Thankfully, what all of this does tell us is that eventually we will most likely see every part of JoJo's get released physically in English. However, depending on how it goes, our children just might be getting ready for college when it does happen.